Hello and welcome, I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're making a Victorian natural form era winter coat or dolman. What exactly is a dolman, you might ask? Well, the short answer is that it's basically a cloak, but it has like a sleeve shape to it without actually having a sleeve. The longer answer can be found in The Fashions of the Gilded Age, the book that I used for my pattern for the dolman. It has a quote from the Harper's Bazaar, October 1878. Wraps are divided into coats, mantles, and long cloaks. The coats are for general use. The mantles are for more dressy occasions. They are made with long square fronts, wide short square sleeve-like openings on the side, and graceful backs shaped by 1, 2, or 3 seams. They differ from dolmans in being as short on the sides as in the back. And another quote that goes on later in the book from the Dress and Cloak Cutter from 1883. This is basically a pattern book that was for the entire natural form era, but it was published in 1883. Well, this version of it where this was taken from. These kind of pattern cutter things used to be published every few years with slightly updated shapes to them, depending on the fashion trends. The dolman is a loose wrap, yet it should give form to the body. On many a piece, a tape is placed inside at the back to tie around the waist and hold it close to the body. Yet it must have such form in the back as it will retain a particular cut, more striking in this than in any other garment. The shoulder, to put the sleeve seam in the proper place, high up, must be cut narrow. This counteracts the tendency of a sloping form of shoulder, while liable to occur on this more than in any other outside garment. The sleeve should have the right proportion of fullness, so that it may hang gracefully without drawing. The front should be narrow, so that the swing of the sleeve is forward, although leading features must take on more or less the same form as each garment. Yet there is perhaps none with greater variety and style in various details as in round and square sleeve. And if that sounds all a little confusing, looking at what is called a dolman and what is called a mantelet or a mantle, it really does get confusing very fast, and especially when you add cloak and cape into the mix, it gets really bizarre really fast, and some of the terms do seem to be used kind of interchangeably depending on where you source it from. But as far as I can figure out, the biggest difference usually, not always, is that a cloak doesn't have sleeves. It is usually like a round cape-like thing, but it can sometimes have a sleeve shape. A mantelet or a dolman does have a sleeve shape to it, but usually does not. A dolman usually does not have a separate sleeve piece on the bottom, whereas a mantelet can have that. But this is not a hard and fast set rule. There is some interchangeability between these, and it gets even more confusing when you look at museum items because those are mixed in with the modern interpretation of the garment. This type of garment is fashionable throughout both bustle eras and the natural form era, kind of fading out of use in the 1890s. There isn't much difference between the two bustle era styles in the mantles or the dolmans, but there is a difference in the natural form era. In the natural form eras, they tend to be a lot longer in the back because of the shape of the garment. It can follow the curve of the back much longer since you don't have a ginormous bustle in the back. But anyways, this was a dressy garment somewhere between a coat, which you have to have separate sleeves in, and that you can't layer as much in because of the shape of the garment, and between a cape, which is super loose and you can layer as much in it, but it doesn't show the form of the garments at all, and you can end up kind of looking like Humpty Dumpty very easily. These would have typically been worn with more dressy items and for traveling, especially in carriages, and then also for opera and fancy evening wear. So basically, anytime you need a coat for warmth, but you really don't want to wrinkle anything by dragging your arm through tight sleeves or anything like that, or in any kind of a situation where you might want to layer more things on, especially if you're sitting in a cold carriage for a long time, but you don't want to end up looking like a moomin. These most often seem to be made out of silk satins, brocades, and different kinds of velvets, and all sorts of fancy fabrics like that. Though apparently there were wool ones, but even those tended to be the more structured, more fancy kind, because, like I said, this is a more dressy garment. I've always been fascinated with these garments because at the same time they have room of a cloak, but they don't look so bulky. So that's why I really wanted to make one, and because I really needed some winter wear for my natural form era things, I decided to go for it.
For my dolman, I used the Dolman for Evening pattern from Frances Grimble's book. I'll link the book down below. The way this kind of pattern works is you get the scale from the back of the book in your half bust size, and then you draw the dots according to the measurements given in the book, and then you connect the dots. The one thing you want to keep in mind with these kind of patterns is that these are quite short-waisted. I'm 5'4" and have a very short back and long legs, and these work for my size always pretty well. For my inner fabric, I'm using an old blanket. I sew the back pieces together and the shoulder seams, and then pin and baste the sleeves in place. This is important because the top of the sleeve needs to be eased into place for a proper fit. And then repeat the steps with the outer fabric, in my case a silk satin, remembering to press your seams well as you go. For fabrics with very little give in them, like this Duchess satin, the top of the sleeve head will need to be gathered. This will allow you to ease the sleeve in. Next, the fashion and the lining fabric are sewn together, right sides facing each other, leaving only a small hole for turning the fabric. Then the seams are clipped to allow them to lay smoothly. And then we turn the garment right side out. And then I hand sew the opening closed where I turned the garment from. For trimming my edges, I decided to use a chenille yarn. This one is pre-looped for finger knitting, so it saves a lot of time. I'll link it down below. According to the Harper's Bazaar, the trimming usually matched the dolman in color, but in a different shade. And a Petersham ribbon belt is sewn onto the center back to keep the dolman in place when worn. And here is the finished dolman. I'm really quite happy with it. I'm sorry I have a little bit of wrinkles in the back. I was sitting in the car for a few hours before filming this, so it kind of wrinkled. I love that I don't feel as overstuffed in it as I do normally when wearing a cape. And yet, other than my ears, I was very warm, even though it was in the lower teens or about -10 centigrade. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button because it really does help out in this world, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye!